If they send you to floor 99, pray the woman down there is asleep. The prison shuttle rattled like loose scrap metal as it cut through the frozen clouds of Vedra 9. Frost crept across the tiny reinforced window beside Ethan Cole's face, turning the glass white around the edges. Somewhere beneath him, nearly 12 miles under the ice fields, the largest alien prison in the sector waited in silence. Ethan sat alone in magnetic restraints bolted to the floor, his dark gray inmate jacket stiff with cold. The overhead lights flickered every few seconds, buzzing louder each time the engines groaned against the storm outside. Across from him, 2 armored guards avoided eye contact completely. That bothered Ethan more than the chains around his wrists. Veteran guards didn't scare easy. One finally looked up as the shuttle shook violently. "First time on Vedra?" the older guard asked. His voice sounded dry. "Exhausted." Ethan nodded once. "Yeah." The guard leaned back slowly. "Then here's some free advice, human." Another violent tremor rolled through the shuttle. "Don't speak unless spoken to. Don't touch the walls on floor 99. And if you hear chains moving in the dark," he stopped. Ethan narrowed his eyes. "What?" The guard looked away first. "Pretend you didn't." The shuttle landed with a heavy metallic impact that Ethan felt in his spine. Outside, snow slammed against the hull and white waves under floodlights mounted along a colossal steel platform. The prison rose from the ice like a machine built to bury people forever. Black towers disappeared into the blizzard overhead, while enormous thermal pipes pumped steam into the frozen air. Ethan stepped out into winds that instantly sliced through his clothes like razor blades. -60 degrees Fahrenheit, according to the blinking monitor above the docking gate. His breath turned white immediately. Guards surrounded him with pulse rifles humming low blue light. Nobody spoke during the walk inside. The deeper they moved into the prison, the quieter it became. No shouting, no fighting, no distant alarms. Just the sound of steel doors opening and sealing shut behind them one by one. Ethan counted 7 security checkpoints before they reached the central elevator shaft. It was massive, circular, descending straight into darkness. Red warning lights pulsed above the doors. Floor 99 authorization required. One guard hesitated before entering his code. Another muttered under his breath. "Still don't understand why they keep her alive." Ethan caught the word. "Her." Nobody answered. The elevator dropped hard enough to make his stomach twist. The numbers on the wall slid downward slowly. 70, 81, 92, 97. The lights dimmed. Frost covered the ceiling vents. Then the elevator stopped. Floor 99 smelled different from the rest of the prison. Cold metal, ozone, burned circuitry, and something older beneath it, like air trapped underground too long. The hallway outside was nearly dark except for emergency strips glowing along the floor. Ethan noticed scratch marks across the walls. Deep ones. A distant metallic dragging sound echoed somewhere ahead. Chains. Slow. Heavy. The guards stiffened immediately. One whispered, "Keep moving." They stopped at the final cell at the end of the corridor. No number on the door. No window. Just thick black steel covered in old impact dents. Ethan heard breathing inside. Calm breathing. The oldest guard unlocked Ethan's restraints, but refused to look at the cell. "Your new partner's inside," he muttered. "May God help you if she remembers your face." The door opened with a long mechanical groan. Darkness swallowed the room beyond. Ethan took one step forward. Then 2 golden eyes opened inside the shadows. The door sealed shut behind Ethan with a deep metallic thud that echoed through the cell like a coffin closing underground. For a moment, he could not see anything except those eyes. Golden, unmoving, watching him from the far corner of the darkness. The air inside the chamber felt colder than the hallway outside. His breath drifted in pale clouds while dim emergency lights flickered weakly above the ceiling vents. Then he heard it again. Chains. Slow. Heavy. Dragging softly across steel. Ethan forced himself not to step back. Years working prison transports had taught him one thing. Fear spread faster than violence. And every guard on this station had been terrified of whatever sat in front of him. The figure shifted slightly. Metal restraints groaned under the movement. As Ethan's eyes adjusted, he finally saw her. She was enormous compared to him, nearly 7 feet tall, even while seated against the wall. Dark silver chains wrapped around both arms and disappeared into reinforced anchors behind her. Her skin carried the deep blue-green color of ocean water under moonlight, though patches of pale scarring crossed one shoulder and part of her neck. Long silver hair fell around her like strands of frozen wire. She looked less like a prisoner and more like a statue abandoned at the bottom of the sea. Ethan noticed something else immediately. The room had no bed, no table, no personal items, just concrete, steel, and chains. They had not built this place for survival. They had built it to erase someone slowly. The woman tilted her head slightly. Human. Her voice was low and rough from disuse. Ethan swallowed once. That obvious? Silence followed. Not hostile silence. Measured silence. Like she was deciding whether he mattered enough to answer. Finally, she spoke again. They stopped sending humans down here years ago. Ethan leaned carefully against the opposite wall, keeping several feet between them. Guess I am special. One of the ceiling lights buzzed loudly before dimming again. Her golden eyes never left his face. No, she said quietly. Just disposable. Ethan almost smiled at that. Almost. A loud crash echoed somewhere far above them, followed by distant alarms muffled through layers of steel and ice. The prison never truly slept. It groaned constantly like an old machine trying to survive the cold. Ethan rubbed warmth back into his hands. Do you have a name? The reaction was immediate. The chains tightened sharply as she moved. Not toward him. Away. As if the question itself had struck something buried deep inside her. No, Ethan frowned slightly. Everybody has a name. Her eyes narrowed. Not here. Another long silence filled the room. Ethan noticed markings carved into the wall behind her now. Hundreds of thin scratches layered over each other. Days maybe. Or years. He stopped, counting after 50. What should I call you then? He asked softly. The woman stared toward the floor for several seconds before answering. The guards call me Buried. Something about the way she said it made Ethan's chest tighten unexpectedly. Not anger. Not shame. Exhaustion. Like she had heard the words so many times it no longer belonged to someone else. Ethan looked around the freezing cell again. The missing furniture. The restraints. The isolation. Whoever this woman was, the galaxy had not simply imprisoned her. It had decided she should disappear. A slot near the bottom of the door suddenly hissed open. 2 food trays slid inside without a word from the guards outside. One tray stopped near Ethan. The other remained several feet from her chains. Neither of them moved at first. Then Ethan noticed hers was empty except for water. The empty tray sat untouched beside her chains while steam rose from Ethan's meal in thin white curls. The smell of synthetic protein and overcooked grain filled the freezing cell, though barely enough to overpower the scent of cold metal and recycled air. Ethan stared at her tray for several seconds. That all they give you? The woman did not answer immediately. She remained motionless against the wall, silver hair partially covering one side of her face. Only her eyes moved, watching him carefully, measuring him. Sometimes less, she said at last. Ethan looked back toward the sealed door. How long have you been down here? Silence again. Then a quiet metallic scrape as the chains shifted slightly. Long enough that the guards stopped counting years. Ethan exhaled slowly through his nose. He had transported dangerous people before. Pirates. Smugglers. Military defectors. But this felt different. This prison was not afraid she would escape. It was afraid she would be remembered. The overhead lights dimmed suddenly before emergency power kicked in. Somewhere down the corridor, alarms chirped twice. Short. Sharp. A warning signal. The woman's expression changed instantly. Not fear. Awareness. Move away from the door, she said quietly. Ethan frowned. Why? This time her voice hardened. Now. Heavy footsteps thundered down. The hallway outside. Several voices echoed through the corridor, followed by rough laughter and the sound of metal striking metal. Ethan stepped back instinctively just as the food slot near the bottom of the door hissed open again. A second later, something small rolled violently across the floor toward him. A compact shock orb. Prison issue. Non-lethal but strong enough to drop a grown man unconscious. Ethan barely had time to react before the orb activated with a loud electrical crack. Blue light exploded across the floor. Pain shot through his legs instantly, forcing him against the wall as static flooded the room. Outside, inmates laughed harder. Welcome to floor 99, human, one voice shouted through the door. Ethan gritted his teeth and tried to stand, but his muscles refused to cooperate properly. The electricity faded after a few seconds, leaving only the sharp smell of ozone in the air. Another voice spoke. Closer this time. The monster still awake in there? More laughter followed. Then silence. Footsteps faded slowly down the corridor. Ethan sat against the wall, breathing hard, while the tingling sensation slowly left his arms. Across the room, the woman had not moved at all. You knew they would do that, he muttered. Yes. Could have warned me earlier. Her golden eyes lifted toward him calmly. You would not have listened. Ethan opened his mouth to argue, then stopped. She was probably right. After a few seconds, he let out a tired laugh under his breath. Fair enough. The woman watched him carefully again. Most new prisoners scream after the first shock. Ethan rubbed his shoulder and leaned his head back against the steel wall. I had worse during Marine survival training. That seemed to surprise her slightly. You were military? Transport division. He shrugged once. Not exactly glamorous. Her gaze drifted toward the floor. Still dangerous. Ethan studied her quietly now that the tension had eased. Up close, he noticed the exhaustion hidden beneath her cold expression. Not physical exhaustion. Something deeper. The kind that settled into a person after too many years of isolation. Then he looked again at the empty tray beside her. Chains. Without speaking, Ethan picked up his own meal and slid half of it carefully across the floor toward her side of the cell. The movement stopped just beyond her reach. The woman froze completely. Even the chains stopped moving. Ethan leaned back against the wall again like it was nothing important. You look like you need it more than me. For the first time since entering the prison, the woman looked genuinely unsettled. Not angry. Not threatening. Confused. As if she had forgotten what kindness looked like. The food remained untouched between them for nearly a full minute. The prison vents hissed softly overhead, while freezing air drifted through the cell in uneven waves. Somewhere far above floor 99, machinery groaned beneath millions of tons of ice. Ethan sat against the wall with his knees pulled slightly upward, trying to ignore the ache still lingering in his muscles from the shock orb. Across the room, the woman stared at the tray like it was something dangerous. What is wrong with it? She asked quietly. Ethan blinked once. The food. Yes. Nothing. Her golden eyes narrowed with suspicion. Then why would you give it away? Ethan almost laughed again, but stopped himself. The question sounded genuine. Not sarcastic. Genuine. Because you were hungry, he said simply. The woman looked down at the tray again. The silver chains around her wrists shifted faintly as she moved for the first time in several minutes. Slowly, cautiously, she reached forward and pulled the tray closer. Ethan noticed the restraint cables immediately tighten the farther she moved from the wall. Whoever designed those chains had expected strength far beyond human limits. She paused before taking a single bite. Even that looked unfamiliar to her somehow, like she had spent too many years surviving instead of eating. Ethan glanced toward the scratched wall behind her again. Those marks yours? Her chewing slowed slightly. Some. How many years? I stopped after year 4. Ethan felt a strange heaviness settle in his chest at that answer. 4 years was enough to break most people. The silence in this room felt older than that. Much older. The woman finally finished the small portion of food before setting the tray aside carefully. Not a single crumb remained. Thank you, she said at last. The words sounded awkward leaving her mouth, like a language she had not spoken in a long time. Ethan gave a small nod. You are welcome. Another long silence settled between them, but this one felt different now. Less hostile. The prison lights dimmed again briefly before emergency generators stabilized the power. Ethan looked toward the ceiling. This place always about to fall apart. No, she answered quietly. Only the lower levels. Comforting. A faint sound escaped her then. Soft. Barely audible. Ethan realized after a second that it was almost a laugh. He stared at her in surprise. The woman noticed immediately, and her expression hardened again. Do not look at me like that. Like what? Like I am still a person. Ethan frowned slightly. You are a person. The words hit the room harder than either of them expected. The woman became completely still again. Even the chains stopped moving. For several seconds, she simply stared at him in silence, her golden eyes unreadable beneath the flickering lights. Then she looked away first. No one here believes that anymore, she said softly. Ethan leaned his head back against the cold steel wall. Maybe the people running this prison are idiots. This time the laugh came clearer. Small. Dry. but real. It changed her entire face for half a second. Not softer exactly, just alive. Before Ethan could say anything else, heavy footsteps echoed outside the corridor again. Different this time. Organized. Multiple guards. The woman's expression darkened instantly. "Stay quiet," she murmured. The footsteps stopped directly outside their cell. A deep mechanical buzz followed as the outer security panel activated. Ethan sat upright immediately. Through the narrow, reinforced slit in the door, he saw several armored guards standing rigidly at attention. Then another figure stepped forward slowly. Tall, dressed in black command armor trimmed with silver markings. The officer looked directly through the slit toward the darkness inside the cell. Toward her. "Open the observation channel," the officer ordered coldly. Ethan noticed something strange immediately. Every guard outside looked nervous. Even this far underground. Even armed. They were still afraid of the woman chained to the wall. The observation slit widened with a sharp mechanical hiss, allowing cold white light from the corridor to spill into the cell. Ethan squinted slightly as the armored officer stepped closer to the opening. His black uniform looked untouched by the prison cold, polished silver insignias reflecting against the dim emergency lights overhead. Unlike the guards beside him, the officer showed no visible fear, only disgust. His pale gray eyes moved first toward Ethan, then toward the chained woman in the corner. "So," the officer said calmly, "the human is still alive." Ethan crossed his arms slowly. "Disappointing, huh?" One of the guards shifted nervously beside the officer, but the older man ignored the comment completely. His attention remained fixed on the woman. "You have been causing problems again." She did not answer. The chains remained perfectly still against the wall behind her. The officer's jaw tightened slightly. "2 inmates transferred to medical this week after provoking your sector. 3 guards refusing assignment rotations. You are becoming inconvenient." Ethan glanced toward her. She had not moved once. "Funny," Ethan muttered. "Sounds like your people are the problem." The officer's eyes snapped toward him immediately. The temperature in the corridor suddenly felt even colder. "You should be careful, human," the officer said quietly. "You do not understand what you are sharing a cell with." Ethan looked back toward the woman again. Her face remained expressionless beneath the flickering lights, though he noticed her eyes lower slightly toward the floor. Not shame exactly. Resignation. Like she had heard these speeches too many times before. Ethan leaned against the wall casually. "I know what I see." "Do you?" the officer asked. "Then perhaps they failed to brief you properly before your sentencing." The officer tapped a command into the wall panel beside the door. A holographic screen flickered to life inside the cell. Static crawled briefly across the projection before stabilizing into an old security file. Ethan's stomach tightened immediately. The image showed the same woman standing in armor unlike anything he had ever seen before. Tall, commanding. Her silver hair braided back from her face, while glowing symbols burned across dark metallic armor at her shoulders. Hundreds of soldiers stood behind her in perfect formation beneath enormous alien banners. Subject designation V-317, the officer recited coldly. Former military supreme commander responsible for the largest mutiny in Dominion history. Ethan stared at the image silently. The woman in the recording looked nothing like the exhausted prisoner chained to the wall beside him now. She looked unstoppable. "You buried her down here for a mutiny?" Ethan asked carefully. "We buried her because mercy became weakness," the officer replied. The hologram shifted again. This time, Ethan saw burning cities beneath storm clouds. Evacuation ships rising through smoke. Crowds running. The footage cut rapidly between scenes before freezing on the image of children standing behind military barricades. Alien children. Small. Terrified. Ethan frowned. "What am I looking at?" The moment Commander Valeth betrayed the Dominion. The name hung heavily in the room. Valeth. Ethan glanced toward her immediately. Her eyes remained fixed on the floor now, distant and unreadable. She refused direct orders to cleanse an enemy colony during the final year of the war. The officer continued. Millions of credits. Thousands of soldiers. Entire campaigns lost because she chose compassion over victory. Ethan looked back toward the hologram again. The children in the footage could not have been older than 10. "Those were civilians," Ethan said quietly. "They were enemy bloodlines," the officer corrected sharply. Silence filled the cell after that. The prison vents hummed softly overhead, while snow battered the outer walls somewhere far above them beneath miles of frozen ice. Ethan slowly turned toward Valeth again. The galaxy had not buried a monster down here. It had buried someone who refused to become one. The officer deactivated the hologram with a sharp motion. You should sleep carefully beside her, human, he said coldly. Mercy destroyed empires long before it destroyed her. The observation slit sealed shut again a second later, plunging the room back into darkness. But this time Ethan could not stop staring at the woman chained against the wall, because now he knew her real name. The silence after the officer left felt heavier than the chains bolted into the wall. Ethan remained seated beneath the dim emergency lights, staring at the darkness where the hologram had vanished seconds earlier. Commander Valeth. The name echoed in his head alongside the image of frightened children standing behind military barricades. Outside the cell, the corridor had gone quiet again except for the distant groan of prison machinery buried beneath the ice. Valeth sat motionless against the wall across from him, her silver hair partially hiding her face. Ethan noticed something strange now that he knew who she had been. Even chained, even exhausted, the room still seemed to bend around her presence. Not through fear, through gravity, like the prison itself remembered what she once was. You saved them, Ethan said quietly. Valeth did not look up. That is not what the Dominion calls it. I do not care what they call it. Her chains shifted softly as she leaned her head back against the steel wall. You should. Ethan frowned. Why? Because every person who defended me disappeared. The answer came so calmly that it unsettled him more than anger would have. Ethan rubbed his hands together slowly, trying to fight the freezing air crawling through the cell. You think they sent me down here by accident? Valeth finally looked at him then. Those golden eyes reflected faintly beneath the flickering lights overhead. No, Ethan exhaled quietly. Yeah, me neither. He stared toward the ceiling vents for a moment before speaking again. I refused an evacuation order during the Carthos riots 3 years ago. My unit was told to pull out and leave the civilian district behind. Valeth watched him carefully now. Did you obey? Ethan let out a dry laugh. Not exactly. The corner of her mouth moved slightly. Not quite a smile. And now you are here. Looks that way. Another silence settled between them, though it no longer felt cold in the same way. Ethan realized something uncomfortable then. This woman understood him better after 10 minutes of conversation than most officers had after years beside him. Valeth lowered her gaze again. Compassion frightens governments more than weapons. Ethan looked toward her. That sounds personal. Her expression darkened faintly beneath the silver strands of hair across her face. I spent most of my life believing loyalty meant obedience. The prison lights buzzed overhead again. Somewhere far down the corridor, metal doors slammed shut one after another. Shift rotation maybe. Or another lockdown. On floor 99, it was difficult to tell the difference. Valeth spoke again before Ethan could answer. The colony they ordered me to destroy was already surrendering. Her voice remained calm, but Ethan noticed her hands tightening slightly inside the restraints. There were no soldiers left there. Only workers. Families. Children. Ethan said nothing. My officers warned me the council would consider mercy a betrayal, she continued softly. I thought saving innocent lives would matter more than politics. A faint smile touched her lips then. Bitter. Tired. I was very naive once. Ethan leaned forward slightly. No. You were decent. Valeth's eyes lifted toward him again immediately. Something shifted behind them this time. Not suspicion. Not anger. Pain. The kind someone carried for so long they forgot how heavy it was until another person noticed. Do humans always speak this recklessly? She asked quietly. Ethan shrugged once. Only the stupid ones. To his surprise, Valeth actually smiled this time. Small. Brief. But real enough to change the atmosphere of the entire room. Then the prison alarms suddenly blared overhead without warning. Red emergency lights flooded the corridor outside the cell. Ethan sat upright instantly as heavy footsteps thundered through floor 99 again. But this time the guards were not walking calmly. They were running. A distorted voice crackled through the prison intercom above them. Attention, all personnel. Sector breach. Detected in lower containment. Repeat. Sector breach detected. Ethan's stomach tightened immediately. He looked toward the sealed door just as the lights flickered violently across the freezing cell. Valeth's smile vanished. Something is very wrong, she whispered. The emergency lights pulsed red across the cell like a heartbeat buried beneath the ice. Ethan pushed himself to his feet as another alarm blasted through floor 99 loud enough to vibrate the steel walls around them. Outside in the corridor, boots pounded past the cell in chaotic waves. Guards shouted over each other, while distant metal doors slammed open and shut somewhere deeper in the prison. Then came a sound Ethan had not heard since arriving on Vedra 9. Panic. Real panic. Containment failure in lower sectors. The prison intercom crackled overhead. All personnel proceed to defensive stations immediately. The message repeated again before dissolving into static. Ethan stepped toward the narrow slit in the door, trying to see into the hallway beyond. Red light flickered violently across the corridor while steam poured from ceiling vents overhead. Several armored guards rushed past carrying pulse rifles and portable shield units. One of them looked terrified enough to drop his weapon. What the hell is happening? Ethan muttered. Behind him, Valeth slowly rose to her feet for the first time. The movement felt almost unreal after seeing her chained to the wall for so long. Even restrained, she towered over him now. The heavy silver chains tightened instantly with sharp metallic clicks as she stepped forward, forcing her to stop after only a few feet. Ethan turned toward her. You know something? Valeth's expression had gone completely cold again. Focused. Military. This prison was never designed to hold ordinary criminals, she said quietly. Floor 99 exists beneath the geothermal core because some prisoners cannot be controlled through normal methods. Ethan frowned. And now, before she could answer, the entire prison shook violently beneath them. Frost burst loose from the ceiling vents while the lights overhead flickered out completely for nearly 3 seconds. Somewhere in the distance, a deep metallic roar echoed through the lower sectors, followed by more alarms. Ethan grabbed the wall to steady himself. That does not sound good. No, Valeth whispered. It does not. Suddenly, the security door at the far end of the corridor exploded open with a shower of sparks. Ethan saw shadows rushing through the smoke beyond the slit in their cell door. Inmates. Dozens of them flooding into floor 99. Some carried stolen shock batons while others simply ran wild through the chaos. Guards shouted warnings from farther down the hall. Then pulse fire lit the corridor in flashes of blue and white. Ethan stepped away from the door immediately. Looks like your prison finally broke. Valeth did not respond. Her eyes remained fixed toward the hallway with growing concern. Ethan noticed something strange then. She was not afraid for herself. She was listening, counting movements, calculating. Like an old commander trapped inside instincts she could never fully shut off. More footsteps approached rapidly outside their cell. Slower this time. Deliberate. Ethan heard unfamiliar voices stop directly beyond the door. This is the one, someone whispered. Bounty still active? Another voice answered immediately. Enough to buy a fleet. Ethan's stomach tightened. Valeth closed her eyes briefly. Move away from me, she said quietly. Ethan looked at her sharply. Why? Because they are not here for you. The observation slit suddenly slid open from the outside. 3 rough faces appeared under the flashing red lights beyond the corridor. None of them looked human. One grinned sharply when he saw Valeth standing in the darkness behind Ethan. Well, the inmate muttered softly. The buried queen is still alive after all. Another prisoner lifted a stolen plasma cutter toward the cell door. Ethan stepped instinctively in front of Valeth without thinking. The inmates outside laughed immediately. Human, one of them said. You have absolutely no idea what is standing behind you. Ethan kept his eyes locked on the glowing cutter outside the door while the red emergency lights flashed across the freezing corridor. Yeah, he said quietly. I think I do. The plasma cutter screamed against the cell door, spraying orange sparks across the corridor while red emergency lights flashed through the smoke-filled hallway. Ethan stood his ground in front of Valeth with his fists clenched tight, despite knowing how useless that was against armed inmates. Behind him, the heavy restraint chains shifted softly as Valeth watched the door with cold focus. The prisoners outside worked fast. Too fast. 30 seconds, one of them muttered while adjusting the cutter. Then we collect enough credits to disappear forever. Another inmate laughed nervously. If she does not kill us first. Ethan kept his eyes fixed on the glowing cut lines spreading across the black steel. You guys always this optimistic? One of the prisoners leaned closer to the observation slit with a grin. Move aside, human. Nobody wants you. Ethan did not move. The inmate's expression darkened slightly. You really think she is going to protect you? Ethan glanced back toward Valeth for half a second. She stood perfectly still beneath the flickering lights, silver hair drifting softly around her face from the freezing air pouring through the vents. But now that he had seen her standing, Ethan finally understood why the guards feared her. Even exhausted, even restrained, Valeth carried herself like someone born to command battlefields. No, Ethan answered quietly. I think she is tired of watching people die for politics. Silence followed that statement from both sides of the door. Even Valeth looked at him differently after hearing it. Then the plasma cutter finally punched through the last section of reinforced steel with a loud crack. The cell door slid sideways several inches before jamming halfway open. Cold air rushed violently inside. 3 inmates immediately pushed toward the opening carrying stolen shock batons, and improvised armor strapped together from prison scrap metal. Ethan grabbed the loose metal tray from the floor instinctively and stepped forward before they fully entered. Back off, he warned. The lead inmate actually laughed. With what? Then everything happened very fast. A baton swung toward Ethan's shoulder. He blocked it, awkwardly with the tray, the impact rattling his entire arm. Another inmate shoved through the opening while alarms screamed overhead. Ethan staggered backward into the cell wall hard enough to lose his breath. Through the chaos, he heard chains straining violently behind him. Valeth. Ethan looked up just in time to see one of the prisoners raise a shock weapon toward her. Do not, she warned quietly. Her voice cut through the noise in the corridor like ice cracking across deep water. But the inmate lunged anyway. Ethan moved without thinking. He stepped directly between them and shoved the attacker backward before the weapon connected. The force sent Ethan crashing against the partially open cell door, pain shooting through his side instantly. More inmates flooded into the corridor outside behind the first group. Floor 99 had become complete chaos now. Guards shouting, sirens blaring, steam flooding from broken vents overhead. Ethan struggled back to his feet, breathing hard. Stay behind me, he said automatically. The words escaped before his brain caught up with them. Valeth froze completely. For a brief second, genuine shock crossed her face. Not because he failed to understand how dangerous she was, because after everything she had lost, someone still instinctively chose to protect her. Another explosion echoed somewhere below the prison. The lights flickered violently again. One inmate outside the cell suddenly shouted in panic. Security breach in the reactor levels. The corridor erupted into confusion immediately afterward as prisoners began retreating away from the lower sectors. Ethan grabbed the edge of the damaged cell door to steady himself, while snow-cold air blasted through the vents overhead. Then he heard a sound beneath the alarms that made his blood run cold. Metal cracking. Deep below them. Massive. Valeth's golden eyes widened for the first time since he met her. Ethan, she whispered carefully. The geothermal barriers are failing. Ethan frowned. What does that mean? Valeth slowly looked upward toward the ceiling buried beneath miles of frozen ice. It means this entire prison is about to collapse. The prison shook again hard, enough to split cracks across the ceiling above them. Frost and dust rained down through the flashing red lights while alarms screamed non-stop through every corridor of floor 99. Ethan grabbed the damaged cell door to keep himself standing as another deep metallic groan rolled upward from beneath the geothermal core. Somewhere far below them, something enormous was breaking apart. Prisoners rushed past the corridor in blind panic now. Nobody cared about bounties anymore. Survival had replaced greed. We need to move, Ethan said quickly. Valeth looked down at the heavy chains still locking both wrists to the reinforced wall behind her. I cannot. Ethan stepped toward the restraints immediately. The locking system had partially shorted from the emergency power surges. Blue sparks snapped along the magnetic cuffs while warning lights blinked unevenly across the wall anchors. Ethan tore the damaged plasma cutter from the floor, where one of the inmates had dropped it earlier. This might work, he muttered. Valeth watched him carefully as he knelt beside the restraint mechanism. You should leave me here. Ethan did not even look up. Not happening. Ethan. Her voice softened slightly beneath the alarms. This prison was built around me. If the lower core collapses fully, floor 99 will seal automatically. Ethan forced the plasma cutter against the restraint lock. Bright orange sparks burst across the steel. Then we better hurry. Another violent tremor ripped through the prison. Somewhere outside, massive blast doors slammed shut automatically one sector at a time. The emergency systems were trying to contain the collapse. Ethan finally felt the first restraint snap loose beneath the cutter. Valeth's chain crashed heavily against the floor. He moved immediately toward the second lock. Why? She asked suddenly. Ethan frowned without stopping his work. Why what? Why are you risking your life for mine? The question hung between them while the prison groaned around them like a dying machine. Ethan paused for half a second before answering quietly. Because somebody should have done it years ago. Valeth stared at him in silence after that. The second restraint finally released with a loud metallic crack. For the first time in years, the chains no longer held her upright. Valeth slowly stepped forward uncertainly, flexing stiff hands beneath the flashing emergency lights. Ethan stood beside her, breathing hard. Can you walk? She nodded once. Yes. Another explosion thundered below them. The entire corridor tilted violently sideways as structural supports failed somewhere deeper beneath the ice. Steam burst through the ceiling vents overhead, filling floor 99 in thick white clouds. Ethan grabbed Valeth's arm instinctively. Move. They ran through the corridor together while alarms echoed across the collapsing prison. Emergency lights flickered on and off through clouds of freezing vapor as guards and prisoners alike fled toward the upper sectors. Several recognized Valeth immediately as she passed. Some froze in disbelief. Others simply stepped aside. Not because of fear this time. Because legends were not supposed to walk out of graves. By the time they reached the upper transport platform, snow blasted through massive fractures in the outer walls. The ice storm outside howled across the landing bays while evacuation shuttles lifted desperately into the black sky above Vedra 9. Ethan and Valeth stumbled through the final security gate just as the prison behind them began collapsing into itself beneath the frozen surface. The sound rolled across the ice fields like distant thunder. Then silence followed. Real silence. Snow drifted softly around them beneath the pale violet glow of the planet's distant moons. Ethan stood there breathing hard while freezing wind whipped across the empty landing platform. Beside him, Valeth stared back at the ruins buried beneath ice and steam. The galaxy had spent years trying to erase her existence beneath that prison. Now it was gone. Valeth finally turned toward Ethan slowly. Her silver hair moved gently in the storm winds while snow gathered across her shoulders. Why did you come back for me? She asked quietly. Ethan looked at her for a long moment before answering. Because they buried the wrong woman. Valeth said nothing after that. She simply looked at him. Beneath the falling snow while the frozen stars reflected softly in her golden eyes for the very first time, not like a prisoner, not like a monster, but like someone finally remembered again.